the economy has not recovered. Employment. The austerity agenda reminds me of medieval bloodletting. The view is that, well, yes, it's painful, but in the end, it'll be good for the patient. We know what happened. It wasn't so good for the patients. They usually died. But the answer was, as they got sicker and sicker, the doctor said, well, you just haven't let enough blood. They still have a little blood left. Let's do it a little bit more. And we all know what eventually happened.
After 4 years living under the coalition's austerity programme, few will deny it's tough medicine to swallow. Average living standards have fallen faster than any time since the 1870s. But during the same period, boardroom pay for Britain's biggest companies soared, and the number of billionaires worldwide has doubled. The rich are getting richer faster than ever before.
A number of things we have to learn about the way the world works. One of the things we have to learn is that apparently the country can't afford the things that it could afford 60, 70 years ago. We need austerity, so the money must have gone somewhere. And apparently where the money has gone, the people who have taken it have been the poor. These have been the people who've taken it. It's the poor who have taken them. They used to be able to afford libraries, we used to be able to afford fire stations, we can't anymore. And apparently it's the poor, we can't take it off the rich. They can't afford it, they've got 2 halfpennies to rub together, the rich. This is mainstream economics now, is that the poor are richer than the rich.
Most politicians and journalists talk like there's no alternative to austerity. We've maxed out the national credit card and need to tighten our belts if we want the economy to recover. But while a pro-cuts consensus holds sway in Westminster, there is growing resistance on the streets and growing instability. In other parts of the world, the price of austerity has been steeper still. The wider inequality becomes, the more austerity seems to be fading from view. It represents a seismic shift in the way our whole society is run, yet already it's become part of the political architecture. This series will decode the economics and join the dots, from the rise of the Great Depression in the 1930s to the far right in Europe today, from the policies of the powerful to the price paid by the most vulnerable. Welcome to the age of austerity.
Education is a right, it's not a privilege. Every child deserves to be taught by a qualified teacher. And I say to you, anger comes from seeing how things are and knowing that it could be different. We are angry, we are here, and we are clear that there is an alternative.
The UK has historically had one of the most unequal education systems in the world, on which we've spent well below the European average. Austerity in higher education begun in 2010. While tens of thousands of students protested outside, in Parliament the government won the vote to treble university tuition fees to £9,000 per year. In the same stroke, they abolished the educational maintenance allowance, a weekly subsidy meant to encourage children from low-income backgrounds to stay in school after 16. Thousands of staff were cut loose, and funding slashed for academic departments. For the arts and humanities, it was stopped completely.
We have changed the bargain between individuals and the state, right? I mean, my children will have to essentially fund their own university educations, or I will have to fund them. That's a choice that we've made as a society, which is, a very distinct choice.
I represent over 1 million students of African, Asian, Arab and Caribbean descent across the UK. Every single day I'm seeing the realities of the increase in tuition fees. For disabled students, it's again around 59% are constantly worried about just meeting their basic living needs. For black students, the same story. And what you're also finding is the retention rates are being affected. So a lot more students who, let's say black students, are dropping out within their first year of their undergraduate degrees because of this financial burden, which is not in isolation from the many other barriers that they're facing. Education is more of a privilege than it is a right. You know, I did a lot of volunteering and work with youth centres and young people across secondary schools within the Midlands area, and just having a conversation with them post, you know, during the time of you know, in the aftermath of those protests. You know, they'd just say, "Oh, miss, are you crazy? I'm not going to university, 9,000 a year. You know, 3 years, I can put a down payment on a mortgage. I can't justify that to my parents to build such a debt."
Our graduates now leave university with an average debt of over £50,000. And with underemployment, falling wages and insecurity hitting the young particularly hard, many are unable to pay it back. In fact, so many students are being forced to default on their loans that the government doesn't look set to save any money at all.
Isn't that absolutely crazy thought? But it doesn't surprise me in any way because, again, policies like that are brought in to transfer money into the private sector.
Children are also being affected at the very start of life. Since 2010, over 200 children's centres and nurseries have been forced to close their doors because of local funding cuts. In London, less than half of youngsters from low-income backgrounds eligible for free early years education still have a place. And in terms of happiness, employment and educational prospects, throughout the developed West, British children have some of the lowest well-beings. Experts are warning austerity will push another 600,000 of them into poverty.
As a student, and also as in a couple of years leaving being a student, going into the job market, I feel like there isn't really much hope out there at the moment. I think my message would be that you really have to tackle youth unemployment in a really serious way by getting rid of some austerity measures and actually putting some money into actually helping to employ people instead of doing what's happening at the moment, which is just completely butchering a generation and throwing them onto the rubbish pile, really.
We're talking about austerity. This ultimately means making sure that we spend as a country effectively what we can afford to do. The ring fencing of NHS services is a classic example. Most people want an NHS, are proud of the NHS and don't want its budget to be cut, and that's been recognised by the current government.
3 years before the crisis hit, Conservative MP Oliver Letwin promised that the NHS would not exist within 5 years of a Conservative victory. His party came to power with David Cameron promising not to cut spending on the NHS or privatise it. Since then, £20 billion have been cut from the NHS budget, and 80% of healthcare provision has been transferred to private contractors. More than 65 emergency units and maternity wards have been shut down.
It may sound extreme to some, but the NHS is being robbed by people in power who don't use it, don't need it and don't like it.
You know, the government were very clever with this bill, apart from the fact they said it wasn't going to happen. No more top-down reorganisation, Cameron promised. He's on YouTube promising it, and then they changed their minds immediately. So what's happening is exactly what we predicted, which is that decision-making process is being handed over to the private sector, the likes of management consultants, who will come in and run that process, and GPs will have to abide by it. So the whole thing about more decisions with GPs is not true. The GPs, in fact, and somebody asked me to quote him on this, he said that we've got less money more responsibility and no power. The government know very well that they cannot upfront abolish universal healthcare on the basis that it was introduced by Bevan in 1948. There would be an absolute riot. So what they're doing is they're doing it piecemeal, very cleverly. And they say that there will always be care free at the point of need, but you have to ask yourself who's delivering that care. Can I get all the care that I want? You know, we're already seeing people having to pay for things that they couldn't have a couple of years ago. The government are very afraid of the P word, privatisation, because they know that the voters and the public and patients do not want the NHS to be privatised. It's one of the core principles of the NHS that the public are very keen to see maintained.
Is healthcare being privatised or isn't it?
You know what? I'm not an expert on the subject. I wouldn't be able to tell you. I don't think it is. I honestly don't know.
The government says private funding will reduce inefficiency, but the NHS has long been rated the best and most affordable healthcare system in the world. In 2010, it achieved its highest ever patient approval rating, upwards of 70%, but within 2 years it had fallen to 58%.
Now you go figure that big companies, and we're talking about now the medical industrial complex, who've got huge buildings full of lawyers whose job is to know how to write contracts. They come in, of course that's their job to put in tenders. They know how to do it, they win the tender because they come and undercut the local services. Very often they'll turn around afterwards and say, actually we can't deliver the service for that, or they'll do what Serco is now doing, as to walk away from services and say we can't make a profit from these. So when you say competition, it's already proving to be a nonsense because these people are only interested, of course, that's the nature of it, you can't blame them for it. It's like blaming cats for hunting birds. Their job is to make a profit for shareholders. If they can't make a profit for shareholders, they will walk away. And we've just seen Serco announce that they're not going to bid for any more NHS contracts.
They've really been trying to erode the public confidence in it by putting out constant horror stories about services and you know, things going wrong because it's so underfunded and understaffed, and these staff are so underpaid that 1 in 4 NHS staff have to work a second job to survive.
People will die thanks to the government's decision to focus on competition rather than quality in healthcare. The coming disaster puts even greater responsibility on us to overturn this destructive legislation.
There is no reason why we cannot have the NHS, as Bevan saw it, publicly funded, publicly delivered, publicly accountable, very important because we're losing public accountability now. A successful public service like the NHS, the most beloved institution in this country, more so than the royal family, a public service like that is simply an affront to the right-wing agenda.
Private healthcare companies are the second largest donors of the Tory party. So it becomes very simple, it's not rocket science, follow the money.
Under the Commonwealth Fund study, which is an international study, came top recently, for affordability, accessibility and all the rest of it. So our vision is really to go back to that, to continue to improve. The NHS always must improve, take account of new developments, be patient-focused, but the NHS cannot focus on making itself better all the time when it's fighting external forces for its very existence, which is what we're seeing. So for heaven's sake, stop attacking it. Accept that it was, until very recently, a very good service. The patients love it. We want to improve it all the time. Give us the space to improve it and not to have to fight for our lives.
Welcome to Carpenter's Estate in East London, just by the Olympic Village. In this borough, where rough sleeping is common and 24,000 families are currently on the waiting list for social housing, 600 of these homes have lain empty for years since the council evicted local residents and scheduled them for demolition. But one of these buildings has been brought back to life. The Focus E15 Mothers Group, 29 single mothers evicted from their hostel last year by the government funding cuts, have occupied the flat behind me and transformed it into a community centre.
I used to live in a hostel called Focus C15, and it's the largest hostel in Europe. It consists of 210 flats, 181 for single residents and 29 for young mums. Everyone that's housed in the hostel has been put there for a reason. People suffering from domestic violence, coming out of social services care, or being physically homeless on the street. So on the 20th of August last year, we were all handed eviction notices to say, all the mums were handed eviction notices to say we had to leave by the 20th of October.
So over the course of the next months, they fought a very loud battle. The council withdrew all of the 29 eviction letters saying that it was a mistake. Now, mostly all those mothers live within the borough, but none are in social housing. They're all in private rented accommodation. With slum landlords, really terrible conditions, and a lot of them live in fear about complaining about the terrible conditions they're in, because they think then that they won't get renewed, that then they'll get blacklisted.
These are the untold stories of the UK's housing crisis. Since 2010, the coalition government has cut the housing budget in half, and over 10,000 families have been evicted, with some homeless shelters reporting a 300% increase in need for their beds this year.
Surrounding these towers, the Carpenter's Tower blocks, which are majority empty, are other very empty but brand new tower blocks with brand new luxury apartments. That's what they're full of, and they're bought up by people from overseas with lots of money, who have no intention of ever living there or ever moving anyone in. It's just a very sound investment because of our property bubble.
Housing is a human right. We have had a succession of governments who are building and investing basically zero in social affordable housing. Boris came out last week and said that and proposed some affordable housing for 2,800 rent a month. Like, that was affordable to... Yeah, Boris, if you're a millionaire.
According to Shelter, the UK's leading housing charity, each pound of cuts to social housing costs the economy £3.50 further down the line. The cuts have cost 200,000 jobs in construction, and with homelessness up by 30% and those with no roof over their heads dying on average 40 years younger, the housing crisis is costing lives.
Well, it really worries me about my daughter's future, because obviously the way things are going, it seems like the working class are just going to be pushed away and driven down, and the rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer, and it is really upsetting to think that. But I think it's really important that people start organising, getting together and express their voices, because we all have a voice and it should be heard. The people that are in power, they work for us, we don't work for them.
The banks bailed out at huge expense by the public. They weren't saved by free market dogma, they were saved by the state. George Osborne takes the EU to court to make sure they can carry on paying those rip-off bonuses. Compare that to the people who've had their benefits sanctioned, their benefits suspended for weeks. And that just goes to show, one rule for those at the top, and for those at the bottom, the result of the financial crisis, where unemployment has soared because of the financiers, that your state support becomes ever more conditional and constantly taken away for the smallest possible reason.
Welfare benefits have been in near constant decline since the 1970s. By 2010, Britain was the most unequal society in the developed West, with 1 in 5 pensioners and 1 in 3 disabled people living in poverty. Cuts to benefit payments for the most vulnerable have been a heavy blow and preceded a spike in depression, drug abuse and suicide.
European austerity is absolutely a public health crisis, and so GPs are seeing their surgeries fill up with people who are the victims of austerity.
These benefits go on the basic fundamentals. They go on food, they go on allowing people to leave their house, they go on paying a carer to come around and help them. I know friends of mine who will lose their funding from the ILF. Now they're going to be faced with the choice between staying at home and not going out or going into care, which is really costly and which will end up making people more dependent on the state. So ironically, these cuts are making disabled people less able to be independent and contribute to society, because it's taking away vital support that they need.
You know, you have programs like Benefit Street. You don't have programs like Tax Avoider Street or Banker Street or Poverty Paying Bosses Street. They make out someone who's living in poverty or on benefits, then they'll get a bit of abuse in the streets. Their kids will be bullied at school, and then no one will ever hear of them ever again. If you try and do that to people at the top, they'll sue you.
You know, if you were to believe the current rhetoric, this country is just full of millions and millions of layabouts, of scroungers, of people who don't want to work, of people who just want to take and abuse the system. And I think that's so disgusting and so wrong. Yes, there's a tiny minority of people who do want to sit on the sofa all day and watch Jeremy Kyle, but that is called depression. All disabled people I've ever met really want to work, really want to contribute. So to have this kind of perception put out there that disabled people are just really happy to swan about and live on the state is really galling and really, really unfair. It's not easy to admit you need help. And what the government's doing is, I think they're making it harder, and I think a lot of people feel really humiliated by this process. And I know a lot of the new assessors have really little knowledge of medical conditions. I know that people have been in assessments and they've said, you know, I'm autistic, and they've been off, what's that, you know.
We get to other arguments around welfare, and it comes down to a question of whether we want to pay child benefit to people earning twice the average salary, and the government's cut that, and that's probably a fair trade-off.
According to this argument, benefit payments should be determined by wage levels rather than any objective assessment of living costs or minimal welfare standards. But in Britain, wages have been falling for the past 7 years, the most sustained decline since the Victorian era. The question now is how low wages have to go before we question the right of employers to set living standards.
The economy is continuing to recover and recovering faster than forecast. We set out our plan, and together with the British people, we held our nerve.
So I think they've eased off a bit on their programme. They've extended how long the cuts will take, but they've eased off on how dramatic they are now, partly in response to that. So what you're looking at the minute is that even with the kind of this sort of slow burn social disaster that austerity represents, you know, the terrible stories you get about 1 million people using food banks, this sort of thing. Even with that taken into account, we've still got about 80% of the cuts programme to go. And most of that is scheduled to take place, funnily enough, after the general election next year.
When I was poor and complained about inequality, I was accused of bitterness and jealousy. Now I've got some money and I talk about inequality, they just accuse me of hypocrisy. It seems simply this subject ain't wanted on the agenda.
Yeah, in people's lives, there's no recovery at all. People are just getting poorer. I mean, that's what the economy means to people. The economy means how much can I spend and what can I afford and can I pay my bills? That is the economy for most people. Do I have a job that allows me to look after myself? If they don't, then the Tories going on and praying about a recovery just looks like triumphalism, which is completely out of sync with the reality of most people's lives. And what it will do, I hope, is make people think, oh, hang on a minute, they're talking about recovery, I'm not getting any better off, my neighbour isn't getting any better off, my friends' lives aren't getting any better off, so where is all this money going to? And of course the answer is, that money is all being vacuumed up by the people at the top. And is that fair? Is that just? Is that rational? Does that make any sense? Of course it doesn't.
In episode 2, we look back at the crash and how it was explained to the public. The government says we're in recovery, but campaigners warn of a cost of living crisis. With such different stories emerging, we take a critical look at the Britain austerity is building and reveal a silent epidemic that is sweeping the nation.